reference in the future. So you all have the ability to share microphone and camera if you want to jump in. If you have questions, we will do a session at the end, but please holler if there's a point we need to stop and clarify. If you have a question that you want right away, please feel free to jump in at any point. But we have a lot of information for you. Explore is being implemented. It is a lot of work. This team here in front of you is doing a ton of work to make sure that this is ready for all of us to understand. So basically, we're going to turn it over to them and get the floor started right away. I think Aaron is going to kick us off here. As we are getting started, would you all mind just entering your name in the chat and what outfit you're with or what location you're at, something so that it can give everybody a little bit of background about where we're coming from? We've got a big crew here, so thank you for engaging on this very important topic. And if you would jump into the chat right away, it should be accessible, but holler if it isn't. And then Aaron, if you want to take it over.
Yeah,
Let's go.
absolutely. Thanks,
Get
Karen.
into it.
Thanks everyone for making time today. This is the second installment in AO's ongoing, and it will be more regularly ongoing member series on the Explore Act. Our goal overall, sorry, I'm Aaron Lieberman. I'm the Executive Director of America Outdoors. Um, our goal here is to help you understand the provisions that most directly affect your operations right now, or that stand to most impact your operations as Explorer is implemented, as agencies develop guidance, and as things really start kicking into gear. Uh, if you missed the introductory overview webinar, which I can't remember exactly when that was put out, but with the legends John Simon and David Brown here, I highly recommend going back and watching that than watching this in sequence. And you should be able to find that, I believe, on the AO YouTube channel.
Yes.
Okay. Before we get started, we would be remiss if we did not put this up here. Just a quick reminder that this discussion is based on statutory language and what we know of agency direction as of today. It's not legal advice, and implementation details will continue to evolve along with guidance. So certainly always check with your line officer, with your authorized officer on how your specific permit may be being handled. And absolutely, when in doubt, consult with your attorney or legal counsel, which is not us. Okay. Super brief. Just what we're doing today. We're going to keep today's session focused and practical, I think. I'll frame up a little bit of the context and recent changes, then I'll hand things over to David and John to walk through what we're focused on today within Explore. And then, as Karen mentioned, we should be able to reserve some time toward the end for Q&A. So as she said, either, put your finger in the air so you don't forget it if you come up with a question, or else just put it in the chat directly. With that, super broad framing to help us start zeroing in here. The Explore Act covers a lot of ground, but at its core, it came out of two broad areas, two broad needs, so to speak, at least from the industry perspective. One, as you see here, is to reauthorize the permitting of authority for the United States Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and more broadly, it's an enormous act, but more broadly, through the industry lens, to address a suite of provisions aimed at streamlining and enhancing permitting and review processes, making things more efficient. As David Brown may or may not speak to, but as I'm guessing most folks here already know, some of the provisions in Explorer are, part and parcel of predecessor pieces of legislation. It's been a long fought and pretty hard fight getting where we are. Again, Explore covers a lot of ground. Today, we're going to be zeroing in. And so up here, I have just a couple, some core areas. And this isn't representative of what we are really zeroing in on today. This is just a sort of brief view of some of the other areas we may be speaking to in some of the upcoming webinars in this series. Today, we're going to be zeroing in on two provisions that directly affect permitting, use of allocation reviews, and surrendered use credits. Uh, these are the tools that will help determine whether and to what degree you're able to maintain, recover, or potentially reduce allocated capacity in iterative renewal cycles or review cycles. And I'm going to leave the nitty gritty of that to David and John as they walk you through it. But as a final sort of lead up into that, we're in a really unique window here. Explorer is law, its core provisions are active, and agencies are drafting the guidance that will govern how these reviews and credits that we're going to be talking about today work in practice. For many folks, maybe on this call, and certainly many of our number of our members, permit renewals may be coming up this December, early next year. So understanding or having a sense of what these mechanics and what these provisions are is certainly very relevant right now. Maybe more importantly, at least in my view, the timing also lines up with the America Outdoors annual conference coming up next month, just a couple weeks. How many days, Karen?
18.
18 days. Coming up in just 18 days in Salt Lake City. We'll have the Forest Service and BLM, as well as Kurt Roush of the Park Service, and David Brown and John Simon and myself there for an agency panel on Explore implementation, where hopefully we'll be able to have more of a dialogue and maybe get some answers around what guidance is being developed, how, and be able to answer some additional questions around implementation of the Act. So that session will be your opportunity to hear directly from agencies and to interact directly with us, whether in this session or leading up to that session in Salt Lake. If you think of additional questions coming out of this you think would be relevant for us to consider bringing to the agencies themselves, please shoot those over to us. This is all to say, just think of this as a foundation both for Explore more broadly, but also as a foundation for going into that discussion in Salt Lake City. Final brief point of note is just when we are talking about the Explore Act and these different authorities, the Forest Service and the BLM are governed primarily by the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act, otherwise known as FLREA, whereas the National Park Service is governed by the Concessions Management Improvement Act of 1998 and the NPS implementing regulations. So if you are with the National Park Service, you're not permitted under Forest Service or BLM. Some of these things will not apply to you directly, or some provisions within Explore will apply differently. And I think David and John can speak to that, or may speak to that at least tangentially in some of the things they cover. With that, I believe I would hand it over to you, David, to walk through. I know it went pretty quickly there, but I promise that was not the important stuff. So I'll hand it over to David as we get into the important stuff to talk through how the use of allocation review formula now works under Explore and what that might mean for your next review cycle. David?
Thanks, Aaron. As many of you may know, I was executive director of AO for about 26 years. So from its start in 1991 through about 2017 or so. But prior to that, I was also involved in regional outfitter organizations. And I remember sitting in my office in 1982 when one of our members in the East got a letter saying that Forest Service permits were going to be put out for bid. And so that really initiated our involvement in the permitting policy that the agencies began to implement. At that time, we organized the first March on Washington, which evolved eventually into Camp Washington. And Some of the same players that were principals in starting AO were involved in that, and within a couple of days, we had pretty much killed the Forest Service efforts to put permits out for bid. Some of you, if you're from Wyoming, you may know Harold Turner. He was among the participants in that event. But in 1985, the Forest Service finalized their permitting policy, and it did have a use it or lose it policy in it. The policy went on for permitting policy went on for it was an interim policy that lasted for 10 years. And then when it came up to be renewed, Forest Service again tried to put permits out for bid. And Doug Timms, who was president of AO at the time, and I met with Gray Reynolds, and we were able to stop that. And then 10 years later, they finalized the permitting policy, and we convinced the Forest Service at that time to extend the permit terms from 5 years to 10 years. And so BLM had done that a year previously, and so we had kind of negotiated that deal with BLM back in around 2002. And so 2004, the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act became law, and that's the authority that became the agency's authority to issue outfitter and guide permits. And it was very vague provision in that law, but the one thing that the agencies really wanted is that all the permit fees and recreation fees that were generated went back to the agencies. So that policy lasted until about 2007, 2008. At that time, the institutional users, some of the nonprofits and/or mostly and some college and university groups wanted more capacity. So they got the Forest Service to implement a change, which established the use it or lose it policy that's been in effect since up until the point of Explorer's passage. And part of the reason that we push for Explorer is to adjust some of the policies that were developed during that time. And I'll go over those as we get into this discussion. The Explorer Act was signed into law January 4th, 2025, and it's much broader than permitting. Initially, we started with the GO Act, and actually before then we had another bill, but the GO Act actually passed the House. It only dealt with permitting. It was only about 13 pages. But when we got that bill passed, a lot of groups realized that there was an opportunity to participate in legislation. And so a broad coalition was assembled, and other recreation interests also joined in. And so the bill just magnified into a much larger recreation bill that deals with things that are not related to outfitting and guiding, like campground infrastructure, veterans groups, access, broadband, internet access, things like that are somewhat related to outdoor recreation. But Title III of the bill deals primarily with permitting. And so today we're going to cover one of the most important aspects of that, which are use reviews. And as you know, the use reviews have been in effect, a version of the use reviews have been in effect since the permitting policy was finalized in 2008. And now that's changed with Explorer. In 2008, the policy was that if you had 1,000 user days or less on your permit, when use was reviewed, you got actual use plus 25% up to your original allocation. Outfitters with more than 1,000 visitor use days received actual use plus 15% of their allocated capacity. And so the Forest Service proposed putting that unused capacity into pools which initially were supposed to be available to institutional users, but they broadened that in the final rule to make them available to broader group of permit holders. Now, we didn't come up with this bifurcation of use strategy. That's something the Forest Service did, and it didn't really make sense because you could actually get more use assigned upon review if you had slightly less than 1,000 user days and if you had 1,000 user days or more. So that was one of the reasons that we pushed for including the use review revision in the Explore Act. So what are most important and significant features of the use reviews that you really need to understand? First of all, prior to Explore, the use reviews were policy. When Explore passed, use reviews became the law for the Forest Service. They're still discretionary for BLM and the other agencies under the Department of Interior that issue permits for outfitting and guiding. It wasn't our idea to make the requirement mandatory for the Forest Service, but some other groups that have been obviously interested in getting allocations or at least getting a share of the use that's permitted push for that. Use reviews are standardized among all the covered agencies. Your use is reviewed every 5 years, and upon review for the remainder of your permit, you will be assigned actual use plus 25% of actual use in the highest of 5 years up to your original allocation if you're considered to be satisfactory. And the satisfactory rating, obviously, as you know, is determined by your performance evaluation. The performance evaluations now are done every 2 years, not annually. That's another change that's in Explore. If you're less than satisfactory in your performance evaluation, such as probationary, you may receive actual use in the highest year, but the agency may also try to limit your use more significantly. There's a little bit of discrepancy in the law about that. We won't go into that detail, but it's important for you to maintain that satisfactory performance rating for you to get actual use plus 25%. The actual use plus 15% for the 1,000 user days or more is no longer the policy or the requirement. That's been eliminated. Another important factor is that a visitor use day no longer referred to as service days, it's visitor use days, and that is defined as a use day, a launch, or any other metric used to assign permitted capacity. Use reviews are not required or issued without when permits are issued without an assignment of allocated capacity. There are a few circumstances where permits are issued, but there's no allocated capacity with it. And in that case, there are no use reviews required. After the review is complete, underutilized capacity may be temporarily assigned to any existing or potential recreation service provider, an organizational camp, or events or group activities. One interesting feature is that those organizations that I just cited are not subject to use reviews, and some are not even subject to allocations. There are provisions that may enable you to get a credit for anticipated unutilized capacity, and John Simon, who's on this webinar, is going to cover that topic in a minute. Well, how will the use review formula work for outfitters who are satisfactory on their performance evaluation? Just to give you an example, if you have 1,000 visitor use days on your permit and you use 800 service days, upon review, your allocated capacity will remain at 1,000 visitor use days. 800 multiplied by 1.25% yields 1,000 visitor use days. If you have 1,000 visitor use days on your permit, or you're allocated that capacity, and you utilize 600, but do not receive a credit for unused capacity, you will receive 750 days, visitor use days, and the agency may temporarily redistribute that unutilized capacity to other permit holders, prospective permittees, camps, events, or group activities. In some situations, the Forest Service and presumably the BLM may put unutilized capacity into a pool that you may be able to access. Now, keep in mind, the Forest Service is mandated to do use reviews, but for BLM, it's discretionary at this point. It's possible that they will adopt the use review policy as well. If your performance is less than satisfactory, but you're still allowed to operate, you'll certainly not get more than 600 service days, which is your actual use in your highest year, unless it's possible you could get a credit for unused capacity and they will apply that. Some of this is yet to be determined, and that's going to be done through a rulemaking process, which we're still waiting for. We had hoped it would have been done before now.
David, before you go on to the next part, maybe just like the 30-second recap summary of prior to Explore, what was in place. So there wasn't the mandatory 5-year review of use-of-allocation for the Forest Service. It is still discretionary for BLM, mandatory for Forest Service. And what are the core changes if you were to give somebody the quick mnemonic reminder of prior to Explore, what was I able to potentially, what was the formula prior to Explore? What was the formula after Explore? Just before we move on to the next part.
It was actual use plus 15% if you had 1,000 service days or more, and actual use plus 25 if you had less than 1,000 service days. The big change is that one of the big changes is that it's statutorily required to do use reviews now by the Forest Service,
and in a set number of years,
and every 5 years. It was 5 years before as well, but currently, if you now with the change in the law, everybody gets actual use plus 25%.
Yep.
So that's the major change. Up to your original allocation. So you really need to understand these use review provisions. Low utilization and there's some certain circumstances I think that are going to create some challenges for a few outfitters. And I'm going to use the river side because I do know some circumstances that are consistent with this description. There's some outfitters, for example, in the Southeast that have shoulder seasons. Their permitted control period may start April 1 and goes through the end of October. They get 100 user days per day, say, for example, throughout that period. Well, they're going to have low utilization in April and May and September and October. And so they're nowhere near that 80% that would basically result in them retaining their complete capacity. So those outfitters are going to have to carefully monitor their use and develop some strategies. And John's going to talk a little bit about one of those strategies to retain their allocation. And there's some other circumstances that I think will be challenging as well, but that's one of the primary ones. So you'll have to have a strategy. You'll need to run your numbers and look historically at your numbers and run those numbers to determine your strategies for retaining permitted capacity. There are one or two that are authorized in Explore that you can use. For example, one of which is that similar uses, the agency has to develop guidelines to allow for similar uses under the permit without going through extensive modification of the permit or NEPA. An example would be if you've been renting canoes and kayaks, your canoe rentals have gone down significantly, but you could rent stand-up paddle boards to replace the canoes. That's one of the similar types of activities that is authorized under, or that strategy or that use type of use would be allowed under the permit. But the agency does have to develop guidelines, and they haven't done that yet.
And when you're saying when you're encouraging folks to take a look at their use and their use history to try to gauge to what degree they may need to be concerned about use, say, in a shoulder season, you mean like looking, for example, let's say that my permitted visitor use days begin in May, but that May is generally a low month in terms of bookings or usage historically, that's the type of thing I'd want to flag and figure out a strategy to account for. Is that what you mean,
Well,
David?
it's not, no, it's your total use for the year, allocated capacity that is going to be looked at, not specifically in different, and in certain months, but it's the, you're going to have to meet that, you'll get actual use plus 100, and it's a little uncertain how they're going to do that. For example, if they reduced your capacity, would they reduce it every day, or would they reduce it during certain periods? So you need to run your numbers through, and I think ask your ranger would be certainly one of the ways to address this if you have questions about it. Now, I have to tell you right now, as we discovered, the Forest Service hasn't really informed a lot of ranger districts about these changes. And we've even seen prospectuses come out that had completely different assignment of use criteria than were authorized, and they're not legitimate really because of Explore. So some of this is still in the gray area and will have to be determined. But you need to look at your entire use throughout the control period. I would think, to calculate your assignment of use. One of the other things that you need to be aware of is the attempts to revise the metric used to allocate capacity. In the past, some ranger districts and forests have attempted to redistribute capacity by converting launches allocated to the permit holder into visitor use days. For example, on the Middle Fork of the Salmon, their allocations are defined as launches. And when the Forest Service implemented use reviews, they tried to convert them to visitor use days. Fortunately, the launch metric was I think, in the management plan, and so they really could not change it unless they amended the management plan. So they backed off on it. But you need to look out for that as a potential issue. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Simon, who's an attorney. He was heavily involved in working both the Go Act and Explore with me, and so he's going to handle some of the issues that I have not addressed.
Great, thanks, David. Good to see everybody. As David said, we've been working together for a while. I've been representing and advocating for folks in the outfitting and guiding industry as a partner with the law and lobbying firm Van Ness Feldman in Washington, D.C. now for a couple of decades, actually. And I worked very closely with David on what ultimately became this permitting title to the Explore Act. And so good to have the opportunity to talk with you all today. As Aaron said earlier, none of what I'm going to say is intended to give legal advice. So please don't take it that way. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just not legal advice. Under Section 313C of the Explore Act, recreation service providers who find themselves not able to use part of their allocation in a particular year can now notify the agency and surrender a certain number of unused visitor use days for that year. As David explained, when that happens, those surrendered visitor use days can be temporarily reassigned by the agency to other existing or potential commercial recreation service providers, actually regardless of their existing permit allocations, as well as to certain other entities. And if unallocated visitor days are available, the Explorer Act actually specifically authorizes the agencies at any time during the term of a permit to amend a permit to allocate additional visitor use days. When you surrender visitor use days, you're not necessarily giving them up forever. It's just for the year that you're notifying the agency and surrendering them for. But how many days you surrender and why you're surrendering them, as well as your compliance with the new agency surrender process, which we're still waiting on details for and should be better defined in some combination of regulation, guidance, and permit terms, can have important implications for your future allocation when the agency does your next allocation of use review. And so connected with that, the Explorer Act allows recreation service providers to ask the agency for a determination prior to actually surrendering use, whether the unused visitor use days that the provider is thinking about surrendering had been or will be prevented by circumstances beyond the provider's control. And the reason this is relevant is if the answer is yes, and there's the agency agrees that the circumstances are beyond the provider's control, you get full credit towards the use-of-allocation review calculation. So you're essentially not penalized for surrendering days that you're prevented from using. On the other hand, if you surrender days that you're surrendering for operational reasons or other things that are within your control, you only get half credit. But you do get half credit, but so you get some credit, but not full credit towards the use-of-allocation review calculation. And the idea here with that determination process is to allow a provider who is contemplating a surrender of visitor use days to be fully informed on how surrendering those days might affect its future allocation. It's important to follow the surrender process by providing notice of the agency of your inability to use the days and to obtain that agency determination. Because reading through the statute, our interpretation is if you don't use them without formally surrendering them, presumably you're not getting any credit towards the use-of-allocation review. So these are really important provisions if your permit is subject to a use allocation and use-of-allocation review. There are still a number of questions on how these provisions will be implemented. We'll see more once we see whatever regulations or guidance or permit terms the agencies are working on. We'll also have an opportunity again to discuss this with agency representatives at the Explore Act implementation session at the conference in Salt Lake. Just kind of want to walk through some of what these outstanding questions are, and this is by no means a comprehensive list. But there's certainly a question of what's considered to be circumstances beyond the control of the provider. It's not something that's defined in the Explorer Act. It is something that we kind of talked through, and that was in some language in earlier versions of the Act, but it was not in the version of the Explorer Act that was ultimately enacted. Having said that, you can anticipate it would include things like natural disasters like wildfires and floods, public health emergencies that could result in closures of the operations, and other unexpected closures of federal lands by the managing agency. Government shutdowns are an interesting question, but one would think that potentially should be considered with outside the control of the provider. Another question is what's necessary to show that the circumstances were beyond your control of the agency in terms of documentation or other support. What, if any, ability is there to claim credit retroactively if you didn't have advance notice of the circumstances that prevent your use of the allocated visitor use days, such as if there's a sudden natural disaster or something along those lines? Um, what happens if there's a common circumstance or event that affects not just you, but multiple recreation service providers, whether in your unit, whether part of the unit, nationally, regionally? Is there anything that differs in the process in terms of how this all works? What's the timing for the process of surrendering or providing notice of a surrender, requesting a determination that your non-use is for reasons beyond your control? And then which DOI agents or which DOI agencies are going to require use of allocation reviews? As David said earlier, this is something that's mandatory for Forest Service. It's discretionary for the interior agencies like BLM, Bureau of Reclamation. And so to what extent or will they require these? And so lots of open questions here. And we're certainly following this, talking to the agency about it, but stay tuned on some of this because they are important. In the interim, if you do have questions and you're getting your new permits or renewed permits, and there are provisions in the permit addressing this, or you have questions about it, certainly bring that up with your permit officer. They may not yet have the answers, but you might as well ask the questions. And the more we do that, to the extent it's appropriate, I think we'll start getting more answers on a broader basis because they're going to have to address some of these things.
And just to add on to that really briefly, John, I'd say also if you do have those conversations and you're, whether it's your ranger or whoever else, the authorized officer does not have information for you, does not have the answers, please flag those things for AO just across the board. It'd be really helpful for us to be able to document sort of systematically in different instances on one buys where these things have or have not been communicated, or even where they have, but there still is confusion, to better inform our conversations and advocacy with the agencies themselves. And starting up, John, there, but I wanted to ask both you and David, I mean, are there any particular things, again, with the disclaimer that this is not legal advice, and we are not, we are not your counsel, this is not legal advice, but any other things you think that you want to add about how operators might think about preparing, or while we wait on that formal guidance, or while they wait on that formal guidance, things they may want to do, things you might want to flag for them? Anything stand out?
Yeah, one thing that if read your permit. I mean, and especially your new permit. And that's maybe one of the things AO can help with, because they'll standardize the permit. They should standardize the permit at some point. And there are going to be changes, probably significant changes. So you'll need to understand those when it comes out. But one of the key things that you need to think of to do, and most of you should know this, and it should be in your permit, is that you need to notify the agency 6 months in advance if you want your permit renewed. That's actually a requirement in a lot of Forest Service permits. And once you do that, that does potentially give you some rights if, for example, the agency doesn't take action on your permit renewal. In other words, it may require the agency to extend that use. And the reason I bring that up is that, we have a lot of permits that are likely to expire in December, and yet they have not implemented the provisions in Explore. And so we're thinking they're going to have to extend those permits until they correct or until they issue a new permit that's consistent with the Explore Act.
Yeah, just adding on to what David just said. So as Aaron pointed out earlier in the discussion, there are a number of key things to look out for in these newer reissued permits. And so these allocation of use review provisions, the surrender provisions are a couple, and we're not going to go into these others in detail, but you should be aware of them. But there are also significant changes on special recreation fee permitting, liability and insurance, cost recovery, and some other things that you should also be aware of and have an eye to as you are reviewing your new permits.
A definition of gross receipts is another one. It's
Yep.
fairly complex. And they authorize flat fees, but that's a whole nother subject that we'll have to get into later.
Yeah, the fee section in particular is pretty complicated.
Yeah. And one
And
thing we
actually gives
did,
you some choices, but it's
yeah,
complicated.
it should be an improvement, but it's very complex. One thing that we did get in the legislation and intentionally is we set the permit fee at 3%. And that was done to avoid fee bidding for permits, frankly. Now, there are amenity fees in addition to that, but at least your permit fee is going to be 3% until the law changes.
I mean, so yeah, there's a lot of things I think, even just within this area that folks should pay attention to. The core thing, I think, correct me if you disagree, John or David, though, is go find your permit, read your permit. I like how David frames this part too. Like, read your permit out loud to somebody. Which, side note, we're going to start a new podcast where David reads you bedtime stories, and those bedtime stories are just the anonymized contents of different permits. It's one of the many things we're working on in addition to the Explore series. But reading your permit, just figuring out what the actual language is, when your renewal date is set to come up, just the core provisions, and making sure, especially upon renewal, what language is and is not in your new permit once you receive it. Maybe before jumping over into questions, because I know that went quickly. I know we're running up a little bit. First, I guess I'd ask anything else, John, before I sort of summarize and go to questions that you think we maybe missed or want to hammer down on.
I'm good.
So I guess overall, like the sum before we go over to questions, I think feel free to jump in to correct me, either of you. But first, on use of allocation reviews, the Explore Act, which is now law, replaced the old optional Forest Service policy with the legal mandate. Forest Service must conduct these use reviews every 5 years. That old split, which David was speaking to, between under 1,000, over 1,000 visitor use days with the different percentage-based, formulas, is gone. Everyone now is within Forest Service, certainly, has the standardized formula applied. Your highest use year in the past 5 years is that anchor, plus 25% of up to your original allocation, presuming that you're satisfactory on your performance valuation. Second, as John was speaking to in the second half here on surrendered visitor use days, you now have a formal mechanism to, I don't know if protect is the correct word, but protect your capacity when circumstances prevent you from using allocated visitor use days, with the differentiated formula that John was outlining between surrendering days voluntarily for half credit and surrendering those unused days that you're prevented by using or from using by circumstances beyond your control, however that may be defined. But as John said, more than likely, well, hopefully, at the very least, natural disasters and other things of that ilk. Wildfire, I would hope. Flood, I would hope. Again, not legal advice. This is not guidance yet, but those seem like the things that fit that category. And in those instances, if you go through the process, requesting that determination and are approved, then you stand to receive full credit for that visitor use day, if done properly. So that, I'd say, is the overall summary. And now this feels like a good time for questions, if folks have them. You should have questions. Sometimes in these conversations, it gets wonky and complicated enough that all you want to do is leave. But does anybody have questions they want to float out here while we have the experts? And if that's not me, that's John and David.
Yeah, feel free to just turn your mics on and jump in if you have any comments or questions.
David and John. Jonah Grove here from Row. Is there some clarity about how this does interact with launch-based permits? 25% of like you referred to the Middle Fork, right? So you have a August 28th launch every year. Are if you don't use that launch for 5 years, can you lose that launch? Or if you use it one in the 5 years, you keep it? Like, is there any clarity on that?
Technically, if if your use is reviewed, you would get it would be your launches would be actual plus 25% of in terms of launches. So if you use 6 launches you say you had 10 launches. If you use 6, you would get 1.25% times 6. And I guess they would round up if technically that's the way it's supposed to work.
Okay.
That issue did come up on the Middle Fork, as I mentioned before. So there's some history with that one, and you can probably go back to that. And I presume, well, I'm not sure whether they use 15%, 1.15 or 1.25 because they were because of the the cutoff. I think they tried to convert that to visitor use days so they could apply the cutoff, and I'm not sure exactly how they did that in the end, but there's some history there. Murray Feldman actually worked on that for Idaho Outfitters, lawyer in Boise.
Okay. Yeah, so in theory, you could lose a launch if you only used 6 out of 10 launches or something every year for 5 years. Is more how it would work.
Yeah, you get 6 plus 1.5. Hopefully they round up to 8.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. I have a couple more if no one else does. But.
I do have one in the chat too. Should existing permits be rewritten? 2 years left on our existing permit.
That's a legal question, John. Do you want to handle that one?
Yeah, John, do you want to provide that legal advice?
So I think
I'm
the
kidding.
answer
It's not legal advice.
Yeah, no, I think the answer is generally no, but there may be provisions in the statute that would be applied more immediately and you wouldn't have to wait 2 years for them to kick in. Like, for instance, I'm thinking about like liability waivers and maybe some other provisions. But I think it would
Because there's
depend
usually
on the terms of the contract and what particular provisions we're looking at. But I don't
there's usually a
expect that the
provision.
agency. Yeah, hold on a second, Aaron. I don't expect that the agency is going to go back and revise its existing permits. And permits are also typically there's language in there that requires compliance with or adherence to applicable law, and that includes regulation, and that stuff can change over time.
That's what I was about to say. That most permits have subject to all applicable state and federal law in them.
Yeah, when the permit expires, they're going to have to use the use review provisions and explore to assign you capacity.
Thanks. Jonah, if you want to jump back in, or if anybody else.
Sure, I'll go ahead. So this is more of a clarifying question, but what I'm understanding is with surrendered use, it's really up to agency discretion what to do with that. They can make it available to other outfitters or other user groups, but they're not required to. Is that
Yeah, that's correct. But I
Right.
have to tell you that there are a lot of resources where, these other institutional users and other groups have been pushing for access. And so there's going to be a pretty, probably a drive. And they're the ones that really pushed the um, codifying these use reviews, into the law because I've been dealing with it for a number of years. Um, when the Forest Service wasn't implementing use reviews, they were in certain areas they were complaining about it. So you would expect them to be the agency to be pushed by in some areas to reassign this use to different groups. They can create pools. Uh, the one thing that remember, you're only going to get assigned use up to your original capacity on your allocated capacity. When the use review is done, you can't exceed your original allocated capacity on the permit. However, there is a provision in the bill that allows you to be assigned additional use at other times. So if there was a use pool established, presumably, and it was you were eligible for accessing that use, presumably you could exceed your allocation under those circumstances.
And do you know if that original allocation, is that original to you when you acquired the permit or original to the permit? Because permits change hands with,
The
historic
permit.
user days. The permit itself. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot about the Locksaw where we're on user days, and one of the outfitters, an outfitter held two permits for a long time. They didn't really ever use one, so that permit went all the way down to 150 user days, down from 1,600, and then it transferred hands at 150. And that company's been trying to get use back, but hasn't actually succeeded. Their last 5-year review, they didn't get allocated use, which I know was frustrating for them. So this is good for them. But just in our history, we've never really seen an agency excited about giving use back. So it'll be interesting to see if this changes that or not at all. Because ultimately they're still the ones in control of deciding if more use is allowed or not. Unless you're butting up against your, uh, unless it's this 5-year review process. But in terms of surrender days and do those actually get, let's say, reallocated to other outfitters or outside outfitters or other groups? It'll just be interesting to see if that makes a difference.
Yeah, and sometimes there are political pressures that dictate how that lands.
I mean, John and Dave, would you expect that in, say, on rivers, right? I was just thinking about it as Jonah was asking the question, but on rivers where the agency has already established a pool, like an outfitted use pool functionally, would you imagine that they would just maintain that structure for surrendered days? So going first to an outfitted pool, there'd be no requirement for them to otherwise change that. The only requirement is that they allow for this ability theoretically and that there is a pool, right?
Yeah, correct.
Although I think it might depend on who's eligible for that pool and whether they're interested in creating another pool for a different group who's not, for whatever reason, eligible for that existing pool.
Right.
There's the use pool policy in the Forest Service is has been established in directives, and so there is a documentation on those use pools that was done in 2008. They're
Good
not
questions, Jonah.
required. They're not required, but the agency has the capability to do it. And there's some examples. I don't want to get in the weeds on this, but there's some examples of where they established them without actually surrendered use. And on the Nantahala, the ranger said, okay, we're not at capacity during these periods. So he set up use pools based on the average use during those periods of unutilized allocation from the commercial sector and made those available to, there's a temporary use permit that was in the rule in around 2008, and that period that is still valid, but it's only for 200 service days in 50 service day increments.
This surrendering process, I'm sure we're going to get more guidance on, but is there timing for that? Or does it just have to be like within the, I just, again, I'm going to use the lockstep because it's an easy example, but we have like a May, June season. Can we surrender in July? I mean, it's still within the permit year. Technically, we still could be using it, but there's no water in the river. Or does it have to be like when we're doing kind of our estimated use process?
I think the agency's going to give you guidelines on that. And
Sure.
technically, the whole reason they put this in the statute is so that the use could be reassigned to others. And so it's the approval, surrendering your use is probably going to have to be done early enough for the use to be put into some kind of pool or be redistributed prior to the season.
Sure.
Now that doesn't preclude them from, if a fire starts and it eliminates your use, that doesn't preclude them from setting, allowing you to surrender those days, or getting credit for them. You might not, but there will be a process defined for that.
Cool. Looks like another question in the chat.
Yep.
Yeah. Can we jump in with one more? We're just looking at a new permit that has a scale of actual use fees, increasing percentage based on meeting thresholds with our use. Can you please clarify if that kind of structure is permissible under Explore?
We'd have to see it. Send it to Aaron.
Yeah.
And let us.
Yeah, we need to
Scale of
see that.
actual use fees based on meeting thresholds with use.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as David said, we need to see that, be able to get a sense of it.
Okay. Thanks. What
That's
Thanks, you
else?
certainly
interesting
take
though,
things.
because some of the agencies have been, or at least used to be, a little reluctant to do some of that tiering, and they seem to be heading in that direction again. So,
Well, why not
interesting
make
to see
something
it.
complicated more complicated, right?
Yeah, there are different arguments for it. I mean, way back when, at least on the Park Service side, there was interest in some bidders in tiering, because it essentially gave the Park Service some skin in the game for encouraging greater use.
Yep.
It's all capped at 3% though, right now. With the Explorer Act.
The permit fee is capped at 3%. It is 3%. It's not just capped at it. It's 3%.
Yeah.
Now,
So they
unless,
couldn't-
Of adjusted
unless-
gross receipts, yeah.
yeah, unless it's a flat fee.
Right.
And the flat fee can be, this could be, the flat fee, if they did a flat fee normally, there was a flat fee prior to 2008. And then in 2008, when the permit, policy changed, the flat fees were only set up for the temporary use and use pools, and they eliminated the flat fee. I mean, they still may be doing it in some places. The only place where the flat fee was authorized was in Alaska, and they did that by rule. So presumably, if they're going to do a flat fee, you would think the forest or the region, where there aren't regions, maybe not regions anymore based on some reorganization going on, but at least the Forest Service would publish a schedule of flat fees. That's another subject we'll get to later.
I was going to say that's a forthcoming webinar where maybe we have hopefully when we have a bit more information. Guidance is forthcoming, but has been slow in getting out there. Any other questions before we wrap things up? And again, if you have more, you could always send them to us too.
Yeah, feel free
Send them to
to reach
me.
out, call, send them by email, whatever works for you guys, but I'm sure questions will be coming.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Well,
they,
David, John, thank you guys so much, not just for taking the time here, but in particular for, the decades of thankless, work that brings things like this about, the slow boring of hard nails and all that. But it really is an enormous achievement, and you guys were a huge part of it. And everybody owes you a real debt of gratitude. So, and also thank you for being here and talking folks through these things. It's pretty complicated, and there are as many unanswered questions as anything. But send those our way. If you do have wonky permits or things that are looking weird on your permits, please send them over to us and we can try to help you out, or, at the very least, point you in the right direction. And stay tuned for upcoming Explore webinars. There probably won't be another one until after the conference, but if you're not
but
already
we'll see
registered for
you all at
conference, yeah, we'll
conference,
see you at
right? We'll
conference. If
see
you're
you
not already
all
registered,
there.
make sure and get registered, both for the Explore panel and everything else. Anything else, John, David, or Karen, before we tie things up?
Hope everybody
No.
has a happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Santa
Thank you
Claus
all.
is coming to the conference.
Yep. Yep. Santa Claus is coming to the conference. We got David locked in. All right, folks. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Everybody.